Very good. Thank you, Zoom. Now I can stop sharing my screen. And here we are. I think Christina goes first. And so thank you, Christina. And while I introduce you, you want to start sharing your screen. Let's
Sure,
make sure there's no last minute glitch.
I will do that.
Okay, Christina Agapakis is a very interdisciplinary synthetic biologist. She's been active both in academia and in the industry at Ginkgo Bioworks. But she has done a lot more. Reading the whole bio would take a long time. In fact, if you just read the bio, you would imagine she's 70 or 80 years old because she has done all sorts of things in many different fields. She has built organisms, she has developed products, and most importantly, she really specialized in collaborations across the human sphere. So very important, if you go to lasertalks.com, you'll find the full bios and a link to their website, which is much more than I can say now.
Amazing. Okay, thank you.
Okay, all yours.
Okay, so thanks so much. I'm very excited to hear your talk too, Jason, and happy to be here with you all. As Piero said, like I trained as a biologist, as a synthetic biologist. Now many years ago, spent 10 years in industry at Ginkgo Bioworks, where I really focused on more like how we communicate about synthetic biology, the way that products get made, the way that technologies like move and grow and change in society, and all of the work that it takes to do that. So this talk is going to give you like a sense of that sort of context, the history, the metaphors, and how I see that sort of happening or sort of changing in the future for both synthetic biology and AI and where they intersect. So this is a photograph from Richard Feynman's office in 1988. So when he died, he had left this message up in the top corner. That's kind of like a cryptic and mysterious little message that has really had a lasting legacy on the mindsets of engineers ever since. It says, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." Uh, and especially in synthetic biology, this phrase was really a rallying cry and a meme for us. And it really drove a lot of the early foundations of the field. In particular, this kind of focus on creating biological systems from characterized parts and that we had to like really, really understand by themselves and in the context of these kinds of new devices and systems that we were creating. For synthetic biologists, the goal was really to do real engineering. And this ideal of engineering really like stemmed from this idea of creating through understanding. And so that relationship now between understanding something and creating something was really, really tight. We had to really understand these parts to create them, and we had to also test our understanding in practice by creating the thing to see if it worked. Sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. But that like central kind of story and the importance of this kind of notion of what I cannot create, I do not understand, was really sort of central. It became the title of many different kinds of papers. It even got misquoted inside of the genome of the mycoplasma that Craig Venter and his team synthesized in 2010. And so this kind of dual understanding and creating from understanding was core to a lot of the early work in synthetic biology, along with a metaphor and really literal metaphor analogies that people use between computers and computer code and computer programming and DNA code and the ability to recombine genetic elements to program cells like computers. People tried to like build switches and logic logic gates, like really drawing from sort of core things in computer engineering and translate them directly into biological systems. Just last weekend, there's this really nice article in Asimov Press about the oscillator by Michael Elowitz and his team in 2000. This is a system with 3 transcription factors that are interacting to create this dynamic system of oscillations, sort of mimicking these kinds of behaviors that happen in living systems like heartbeats or other kinds of sort of like pulses through this kind of simple genetic system. So like in some ways, yeah, like it kind of worked, right? Like you could test these theories about the behavior of cells. You could create new kinds of dynamic kind of behaviors. But I think there's actually like a reason why we're still talking about the oscillator 25 years later, and we don't see like a huge success from this kind of particular approach in that has translated into industry, into medicines, into pharma. Whereas I think in general, there's lots of ways that we interact with biology that has made big strides, but this kind of like core belief system like has not sort of played out the way that I think a lot of people thought it would. And I think that the reason that this kind of programming still sort of remains elusive is that this idea in the first place that we can program things like according to kind of like this preset program and it'll act for us is soon actually going to be like fully obsolete. And so, but before I get to that, I want to kind of go back to Feynman and what he said about creating an understanding, because I think there's some irony there in the fact that for us as engineers to be using the statement from a quantum physicist as a sort of like iconic foundational story. For Feynman, like he didn't create anything, right? Like he created equations and sort of concepts to help us understand the world at the quantum level. He also was involved, though, in the creation of the atomic bomb, the full impact of which no one perhaps involved in that early Manhattan Project was able to fully understand. And so people have already sort of started to kind of like question this kind of aphorism again in synthetic biology and turn it backwards. Like, do we understand what we create? Like Marcus here was really thinking about this in terms of security and risk and safety. Like, do we know all of the implications or possible downstream things that will happen when we engineer biological systems? Like, I think that there's, again, some lessons from maybe Feynman's generation where that seems like maybe we don't fully know what could happen and we should think about it really hard. But like, I don't want to focus too much on those kind of like this risk aspect. I want to think about it again, like through this again, like another inversion of this quote, because I think the lack of understanding of what we create is not just a lack of understanding, like of kind of potential downside risks, but also sort of like a deeper and more embedded way of not understanding something or not controlling it. Because with biology, we actually create lots of things that we could never fully understand and never fully control because they are alive. They have their own agency and their own autonomy, and they act in the world like based on like what they see and what they experience. We don't specify all of the things in advance. We do not design them from scratch. We nurture them to grow. And so these are my 2 wonderful children. They are a collaborative bioengineering project that I've had the privilege to work on for about 9 years so far. But of course, it's not the same as what you might do as an engineer, right? Like, it's not that I said like they should act this way and I will control and make sure that they do. In fact, I have to like care for them. I have to like nurture them. I have to help them grow in an environment that is safe and nurturing so that they grow into their own agency, their own control of themselves, and their own kinds of interactions with the world and the people around them. And so like this extends like very, very deep, I think, into the ways that we have interacted with biology forever. And I think it will and should shape the way that we think about technologies in the future. When you talk to people in the world of bioengineering about some of these kinds of questions and histories, or like about just genetic engineering in general, you've probably heard sorry, you've probably heard people say things like, oh, like people like shouldn't worry so much about GMOs. Like we've been genetically modifying things for thousands of years. And so uh, this is an example of one of those things. Like the top one is a kind of grass. It's been bred over many generations and years into the corn that we all know and love. And so yes, we are able to change and to interact with things at a genetic level and change them fundamentally through our interactions with them. But I think that this kind of like this quip, it's also in itself a thought terminating cliche. It's meant to actually like end our questions about that relationship and how we work with things and how we live with biology and what we extract from them. It's not meant to like, yeah, to continue asking questions. It's meant to stop you from asking questions about GMOs. And that's why I think it's not a useful term for us as genetic engineers to use. And so I think that in fact, when you think about more deeply, like, and you actually like start to ask those questions, well, what does it look like? Why do I, what do I like? What's different about sort of breeding and like the way that we have worked with organisms for many years than what we're doing with GMOs? What could it look like? Why is it like this or that? And I think that we start to see biology as a different kind of technology, like one that could be one like based on these kind of notions of care, of nurturing, of connection, of creation through relationships, like rather than from a kind of like sense of like, I fully understand, I fully control this kind of thing, what that real engineering was sort of spoken about as synthetic biologists. And so in my research and the artwork I've done collaboratively with other artists, like I've looked at things like cheese making as one of these kinds of ancient biotechnologies. Cheesemakers craft the environment that different kinds of species of bacteria and fungi live together, and like they produce different kinds of acids and other kinds of molecules that preserves the milk and creates something of value to humans. That value is like cultural, it's also nutritional, it has all of these different kinds of entanglements sort of embedded in it. And it's something that people have been doing for millennia, like before anyone knew what a microbe was, before anyone had any sort of concept for understanding these kinds of metabolites or molecules or fermentation. And so when we kind of think again about that Feynman quote, right? Like the sense like what I cannot create, I do not understand, like that inverse is not true, right? Like we can and do create with biology all the time without that kind of like molecular or technical understanding, but a kind of understanding nevertheless that emerges through these kinds of like deep interactions and connections and relationships with living things. And so I want to sort of draw on this like legacy and sort of tradition from feminist scholars and philosophers of science, people like Evelyn Fox Keller, who focus on those kinds of interactions, like the relational work, the care work that goes into how we interact with our model organisms, with the species that we interact with when we build these kinds of technologies, because it's a really critical context for how we understand and how we make science and how we make technology and how those technologies operate in the world. But like because they are things that have been traditionally coded as feminine behaviors or characteristics, they are also things that are sort of like kept outside or rejected from science and technology and like a deep understanding of how science is made. So feminist scholars really hope to sort of like, again, bring all of those kinds of human experiences to how we think about and understand the way that we make science and technology. It's so in how those kinds of different points of view, the different values, the different actions, the different interactions, the different context really matters and should be recognized in the way that we make technology. So what about AI? My title today was AI as a feminist technology and how biology and computation and new kinds of paradigms and metaphors might shift the way that we think about these kinds of technologies. And AI, I think, is really interesting because, again, like biology has drawn all this metaphors from computer engineering, but at the same time, computer science and computer engineering and software has also taken a lot of insight and influence from biology. Neural nets and the ways that AI works. Again, I'm not a computer scientist, so Jason will have to like tell us all about this. But they learn from this kind of contextual understanding that emerges from our training sets and data. And so I would argue that AI is itself a feminist technology, not because it is like a girl or like for girls or like feminine in any way, but that how it is designed, how it operates, its affordances create a kind of technology that like embeds these other kinds of interactions that again have been sort of historically gendered female, and have been sort of tried to be brought back into the ways that we think about science and technology by feminist scholars. So yeah, like the systems themselves like learn from context, like have a draw from all these kinds of contextual interactions, have these emergent properties that come from them. They have this interactive quality to them. The way they are designed is to operate through conversation and through interaction. We do not program now by specifying what will happen. We ask the computer to do things. And I think that's very interesting. I can be like, hey, ChatGPT, like I'd like to make a website. Can you help me do it? And it does it with me. And it's a relationship that feels much more like the work I do now as like kind of a creative director or marketing director, where I'm like, hey, like I want to work with a dev to build a website. Like this is what it should say and how it should look and how it should feel. Like, oh, how about this? How about this? It's this kind of like interaction and workshopping that kind of emerges through the collaboration. I think it's also really kind of beautiful that we train these things, that we teach them. We do not program them. We talk about sort of training. I sort of love in particular, like in its infancy, in the early days of these kind of AI systems, we all trained it the way that I taught my toddler how to talk, right? So like, you see a bus and you punch, you say bus. And I don't know, I think that's beautiful. So I spent some time talking with Claude about this, of course. And so like, despite I think how people talk about like AI as this almost like view from nowhere, like a kind of general intelligence that again sort of like it sort of erases all of those kinds of contexts. I think actually Claude itself like has a deep understanding of its biases and its context and why that matters. I think it also sort of points to a different kind of possible future, not again like one of those like dominant stories about like capitalism and like who's gonna win the race, like and the sort of like geopolitical context of like how like who wants to like win with AI. That AI is in fact like showing us that the technologies are these kind of situated technologies. So I asked it about situated knowledges, which is again one of these like feminist scholarship of science and technology, and it says, and Claude says, yes, my knowledge is highly situated. It's bounded by my training data cutoff date, shaped by my specific texts and data I was trained on, and emerges through direct interaction with humans in particular conversational contexts. I do not have a view from nowhere. My responses are always shaped by the specific context of our conversation and my training. My knowledge could be seen as situated in the broader socio-technical system that produced me, the decisions made by developers, the selection of training data, and the computational infrastructure that enables my operation. And so, again, I think that's beautiful. But back to Feynman, AI, like many biotechnologies, is also something that we created, but also, again, something we fundamentally do not understand. So there's a really, really interesting new literature and almost like a new discipline forming at the edges of AI research on AI interpretability, really like looking at the responses from these systems that are themselves in some ways a black box, and trying to understand deeply, like where did those responses come from? What could it be? Like really probing them, as this tech review article says, as a strange natural phenomena. And so actually, like my former colleagues and folks I know and my friends in synthetic biology, like who sort of take the strong argument of what real engineering is, like actually do reject AI as not a real technology. It's not real engineering because of that sort of black box quality of it. Like you cannot see inside of it. You do not know how it works. You do not understand it. You've created something you do not understand, and therefore it's not real engineering. And so I think, again, like this is causing a kind of like renegotiation, and I think like a reconsideration of like what technology is, what it should be, what an engineer is and does, and how these kinds of technologies that might therefore operate in the world. Um, for This is James Bridle wrote this really beautiful book, Ways of Being, really deeply looking at all the different kinds of ways that we might look at intelligence from a point of view of the different kinds of organisms in nature, a kind of more than human approach to intelligence, and how might that change the way that we look at technologies like AI? How might it change the development of these technologies and the impacts that they could have? They call it this kind of concept of unknowing, um, and that this unknowing is again a core feature of what a more like decentralized, a more liberatory technology could look like, if we took seriously some of these lessons that we get from these new forms of intelligence and AI. And so they write that machine learning, in fact, is tuned towards unknowing, and that many of the applications of machine learning in self-driving cars, even in science itself, are being pursued precisely because of the realization that the appropriate response to new stimuli and new phenomena cannot be pre-programmed. We want to have our technologies, like living things, be able to have that kind of agency to respond, to adapt, to change their behavior depending on the situation that that is called on, that they are called to react to, and that reaction like has to be happening constantly in dialogue with that external world, in order for that to be continuously like fruitful and positive for what we want. And so there's a really interesting history that Bridle and others kind of look at in the history of computation, of like where we kind of let that approach to engineering drive, like rather than the kind of real engineering of synthetic biology and like that sort of strand of computer science. Like when you look at the history of cybernetics, and other kinds of and other kinds of engineering that do sort of take advantage of those like living systems and their agency, in order to create new kinds of technologies, that's almost like a totally parallel kind of type of technological development. And I think there's also been a lot of really, really interesting artwork that engages this, and like sort of artistic research, that sort of asks, again, these kinds of different kinds of questions about technology, how it could be made, how it could be made differently, and how that could have different kinds of impacts. So Bridle and Pickering, who's a historian of cybernetics, they talk about this example, the cockroach-controlled robot by the artist Garnet Hertz. And so in this example, the Garnet Hertz takes advantage of the cockroach's natural tendency to scurry away from bright light, and velcros the cockroach onto this track ball. And so as it runs, it moves the ball, and the ball moves the robot. So the robot can now be programmed to respond to light, without having to write any code at all, and just to use these kind of like natural intelligence of the cockroach. And so I love there's so many different really interesting examples that from science and engineering, but also from arts, that use this kind of principle and create these almost symbiotic machines. So like slime molds and fungi that also respond to light. In this new science article, they talk about robots that move in response to slime mold's fears. Again, like that sort of like evasion of light is sort of recast as a fear. The same with the robot above, again, like fungi now controlling it. But they also have these kinds of, again, like those in the scientific and technical context, they're often looking at these kinds of like functional aspects, like what might biohybrid robots be able to offer us, in a kind of technological context. In the art context, they often become like more symbolic, like the plant wielding the machete, or in this case, like a brain-controlled sperms in Annie Lou's work. I think that like I'm super interested in the cultural and these kind of techno-scientific implications of what this research is opening up for us. Like both the artistic and the scientific research and AI research, is driving us like towards like again like a reconfiguration of technology that emerges through these kinds of like interactions, through work of care, through networks of interaction, and like new kinds of behaviors and possibilities are emerging. emerging. So like, will computers look more and more like living things? Will they themselves be made out of living things? There was research making kind of an analog computer out of crabs in 2012. More recent work from some companies is actually trying to make neural networks out of literal networks of neurons. Like, what are the things that might start to be possible if you open up this kind of like more hybrid and like expansive approach when you look at biology? And then conversely, like, how will these new paradigms for programming and interacting with computer systems like change how we think about biology in turn, right? So like, oh, if biology like really depends on this kind of like these metaphors like from computer programming like 70 years ago, like what happens now, like when the paradigms for programming change, and like the ways that we think about code or encoding are changing, how does that change the way that we might think about biological code? And so there's some really, really interesting kind of early work happening at the edges of biology and AI research. This is a paper from Michael Levin and Benedict Hartle about really like taking very literally a metaphor of biology, like from generative AI and LLMs. Like, what if the genome is not a code or a blueprint or the book of life, again, like something that programs the behaviors of cells? But what if it's literally a generative AI model, like one in which like latent variables from the training set, like over evolutionary history and all of the experiences of the ancestors of this organism has encoded into the DNA strand. And then like that DNA then is able to generate kinds of behaviors and sort of behaviors and structures in the body in response to prompts that happen during the growth and development of the organism. And so I love this. I'm obsessed with this as idea, like because I care a lot about metaphors and I've been sort of like seeking out like new ways of thinking about DNA. And like, what if it looked like, you know, what if we took biology for real? And it's so very, very interesting to me that like the biology story had to like go through computing to come back again to biology in order for us to like have new metaphors to try to understand the living world. And to sort of like look at that sort of like non-deterministic or like complexity of the genome, like in its environment, like with real curiosity, like that like biology is not destiny, DNA is not destiny. There's everything kind of happens through these interactions in ways that we have not been able to fully characterize and may not be able to sort of fully specify again in advance, but the approach with a very different kind of mentality. And so I want to close by going back to Feynman, and think more about the irony of the quote and how it drove synthetic biology for so long. Because yes, Feynman, not an engineer, he was, like I said, a theoretical physicist, and in his particular branch of physics, in quantum mechanics, he's also been quoted as saying, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics." And so Feynman was part of a generation of physicists who actually like really fundamentally transformed how we do and importantly don't understand the world. And they saw this transition from a world where physics and math was really deterministic, like you could explain things with math, and like science was set to like understand everything about the world, to a world where as they went deeper and deeper into like what an atom was, they found things that were sort of fundamentally unknowable. There was incompleteness, uncertainty, a kind of duality that made it impossible to pin anything down for certainty. And I think it was really like transformative in really interesting ways. And so I love Benjamin Labatut's work, When We Cease to Understand the World, and his second novel, The Maniac, are really excellent sort of narrativizations of that experience for the scientists of how they sort of like what that felt like. And I think that sort of feeling or emotional experience of like encountering that uncertainty is actually maybe something that's really, really important to unpack, and something I think again a lot about as now a marketer and someone who thinks again about like the role that emotions and these kind of human dynamics play in how technology is communicated, is received, is perceived. And so like the other kind of thought terminating cliche that scientists and synthetic biologists and genetic engineers use a lot is this notion that people fear what they do not understand. So again, like kind of like, again, another variant of that Feynman quote, like the reason perhaps why people reject vaccines, reject GMOs, reject AI, is actually born from a fear that comes from a lack of understanding. And again, like this is meant to stop people from thinking harder because they have like, oh, I guess I'm stupid. Like, am I stupid? Am I not like, right? Like, I guess I don't understand. Like, it's not meant to have us ask more questions, like understand where or like where that kind of discomfort is coming from, what kind of values are like generating those feelings. And again, like vice versa, like what kinds of values and reality are being embedded in the technologies that are causing the reaction from people. And so for engineers, like we like really do fear not understanding something. And so I think that's like actually where this sort of argument comes from. Like we sort of project the sense that like, oh, your fear comes from not understanding the technology because we fear not understanding. We want to be able to fully understand and fully be able to do that characterization and therefore fully be able to create. And so for synthetic biologists, the idea of biology like not being really understandable, like not really being engineerable, being a little bit random, being hard to work with, that was really like not acceptable to the early synthetic biology days. And like I think that is also now like starting to wane, like because it just like we cannot force our will, our desire to understand onto biology. I think we have to interact with it in different ways and in some ways on its own terms in order to be able to get to that point of technologies that work, that we can care for, that can exist in the world. And so, like, maybe it's a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but the antidote to fear is not domination. It's not more control. It's not like a sort of like demand for more understanding. I think it's love. And so my friend Abby here, uh, he posted on Twitter the other day, I love this so much. Like somebody asked, like, so what's necessary for making generalizable foundation models in biology? Like what would make them better? Because like the AI models so far in biology, again, like there's a lot of hope and promise that AI will solve some of this like lack of understanding and lack of control of biology and synthetic biology, but it's not there yet. It's not quite there. And so he's asked, what's going to make it work? And Abhi is actually a writer and a ML engineer at a biotech company, and he writes that it's love. You cannot simply force feed a model with terabytes of data and expect magic. This has never been the case. Magic comes from love. And I think that this is very true. Like because people make technology. When I was at Ginkgo, like I heard every single argument about GMOs possible. We were a bioengineering company. We did GMOs as a service to other people. And there was this kind of constant anxiety. And I think that the intervention in those conversations that was the most impactful of anything I did as leading marketing and storytelling for the company was making this little sticker. It took me like 15 minutes. I made a little I Heart GMO. I found the right font. And it really made it this possible for us to have this conversation of like, well, what could we love them? Like, what is it about them? Like, who made like what were they designed for? What is a lovable GMO? Like, how would I grow it and take care for it? And there's a new kind of generation of products that are kind of coming from biotechnology that kind of that fits this mold. I had glowing petunias in my house, from Light Bio. I grew purple tomatoes that were engineered. There's a lot of other kinds of ways to interact with genetic engineering, like rather than this kind of the ways that we may have seen it already so far. And so I hope that like our interactions with AI may be able to sort of learn from these kinds of lessons, and like take advantage of these kind of like contextual relational understanding of how we interact with the AI itself, that we're not starting from the point of like wanting to dominate the computer, but we're having these conversations. I'm see, you know, it's not going to happen by default, and certainly like the current political moment is one like of like really wholeheartedly adopting genetic determinism, of seeking dominance and control in any possibility, in any possible way. And I think again, like in my sort of Pollyanna-ish hope, I hope that we can undo that, and that perhaps the better quote for us to go for is not "what I cannot create, I do not understand," but "what I cannot love, I should not create." And so that is what I wanted to talk about. So that's the end. I will stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the very
you.
informative and passionate presentation. A lot to digest. I think I will have to watch the video a couple more times to absorb everything.